Okay, so we've got this whole stack of sources here about the way India is run.
Yeah.
It's a lot. Laws, education, environment. You even threw in some international relations stuff.
Mm.
Seems like you really want to get the full picture, huh?
Well, it's all connected, right?
Yeah.
If you really want to understand how India works, you got to look at it from all these angles.
For sure, for sure. So we've got like excerpts from academic studies and legal analyses, even some news articles thrown in there.
Yeah, real mix.
It's quite a mix. So our goal today, and by today I mean this deep dive, is to break all this down, help you make sense of it all, and walk away feeling like you could, like, I don't know, explain how India works to somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to like unpack the complicated stuff, point out the surprising things,
Right.
and hopefully give you a deeper understanding of how things work in India
Yeah.
on like all these different levels.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. And speaking of surprising things, did you know there's like a whole debate about whether they can even change the most important parts of India's constitution?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, we'll get to that later, but first, let's start with something that affects, well, everyone. Education. You gave us a document about the Right to Education Act, or as everyone calls it, the RTE.
The RTE. Yeah, that's a super important law. Make sure all kids between 6 and 14 can go to school for free.
And have to, like it's the law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's made a huge difference, especially for kids from like poorer families. You know, way more kids are in school now because of the RTE.
That's awesome. And there's even this study in here. It found that more education means people are more aware of health problems. Like they specifically mentioned diabetes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it's not just about like reading and writing. It helps people take care of themselves too.
Totally, totally. But the document also mentions that the RTE doesn't like reward kids for going to school and doing well.
Oh, okay.
So it's like getting them in the door is one thing, but keeping them interested and making sure they actually learn, that's the next challenge.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's one thing to make them go. It's another thing to make them want to stay and learn.
Right, right.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Judicial review in India. This is how the courts keep the government in check, make sure they're following the rules.
Right, like the rules of the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So the courts can basically step in and say, hey, is this law okay? Are you guys doing what you're supposed to be doing?
Exactly. It's like a way to make sure no one gets too powerful. You know?
Yeah.
Keeps things balanced.
I like that, balanced. And you even gave us some examples, some big court cases that show how this works in action.
Oh, yeah, those are classics.
Like Case Fernanda Faradi versus State of Kerala, that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, but important.
And then there's SP Bomai versus Union of India.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, so these cases show how the court has actually stepped in to protect people's rights.
Yeah, and stop the government from overstepping, you know?
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's not just like theoretical stuff either. This judicial review thing has real-world impact, like protecting the environment.
Right.
You mentioned MC Mehta versus Union of India. That case established this idea that if you damage the environment, you're absolutely responsible, like no excuses.
Yeah, the courts basically said that everyone has the right to a healthy environment.
Mm-hmm.
And they're using their power to make sure that happens, to like hold polluters accountable and stuff.
Wow, powerful stuff. So basically the courts in India, they don't just like interpret the law, they're shaping how the whole country runs.
Exactly, making sure it lives up to those big ideals in the Constitution.
I like that. Okay, so let's change gears a bit. Zoom out from like the national level and look at the local level, you know? Like what's happening in the villages and towns.
Okay, yeah.
You gave us this really interesting stuff on how India is giving more power to local communities. It's called the panchayat system.
Yeah, the panchayats.
Yeah.
It's basically like giving people a direct say in how things are run in their own communities.
That's cool. So like instead of everything being decided in some far-off capital, people get to have a voice in what happens in their own backyard.
Exactly. And it's been really effective. Led to more people participating in politics, you know, more representation for women, even helped with things like sanitation and hygiene.
Wow. So they're like actually getting stuff done.
Yeah, they are. It's a really good example of how this ancient system of village councils is actually being used to solve modern problems.
That's pretty awesome, taking the best of the old and the new, huh?
Exactly. It's not all perfect, though.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, some of the stuff you gave me, it talks about how there can still be problems with corruption, even at this local level.
Oh, right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And sometimes they just don't have enough money to do everything they want to do.
Right. So it's not like a magic solution.
No, not at all. It's more like it moves the problems to a different level.
Mm-hmm.
You know, instead of the problems being at the national level, now they're at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still problems.
So it's still a work in progress.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about education, the courts keeping things in check, and giving power back to the people at the local level.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. But now let's zoom back out and look at the national level again.
Oy.
Specifically, how laws get made. You gave us some info about these things called parliamentary committees.
Oh, yeah, those are super important.
Yeah. So what do?
They basically examine new laws really closely before the whole parliament votes on them. They hold hearings, talk to experts, make suggestions, all to make sure the law is actually good and considers all the different viewpoints.
Wow, so it's like a quality control check.
Exactly.
But looking at the stuff you gave me, it seems like these committees are being ignored more and more these days.
Yeah, it's kind of worrying.
Yeah, how so?
Well, fewer bills are being sent to them,
Yeah.
and they have less time to do their work. It's like they're being rushed through.
So it's like making a big decision without really thinking it through.
Exactly. And for people like you who care about how India is run, this is a big deal because it raises questions about who's actually making the laws, you know?
That's a good point. Who is in control? Okay, now on to something super important for any democracy. Elections. You gave us some info on the Election Commission of India. They're the ones who make sure elections are fair, right?
Yeah. They're like the referees of the election game, making sure everyone plays by the rules.
So no cheating. And it looks like they've been busy making changes to make sure things are even more fair.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They've got this Suvita portal so people can file their nominations online, which is super convenient. And Ability Express is making voting more accessible for people with disabilities, which is awesome.
That's really cool. What else are they doing?
They're really trying to crack down on using money and muscle power to influence elections. Trying to make sure it's about the people's choice, not about who has the most money or influence.
Makes sense, yeah. They really seem to be taking this seriously, making sure that every vote counts. But you know what? Makes you think. Are these reforms enough? Like, what else could they do to make elections even more fair? That's something for you to think about as you learn more about how India works.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing process. There's always room for improvement,
Right. Okay, we've covered a lot, but we're just scratching the surface. Now let's look at the foundation of India's governance, the Constitution. Specifically, some key words in the preamble, socialist and secular, they've been interpreted in different ways over time.
Yeah, those are big words, and they mean different things to different people.
It's like the preamble is this living document constantly being reinterpreted as India changes and grows.
Right, exactly.
There's this one case you mentioned, the Kesavananda Haradi case. It really shaped how we understand these words within the legal system.
Yeah, that's a landmark case. It shows how the Supreme Court has been figuring out what these terms actually mean in practice, making sure they reflect what Indian society stands for today.
So it's not just some dusty old document. It's like a guidebook that's constantly being updated.
Yeah, a living, breathing document.
Okay, get ready for this one, because this is a biggie. You included info on the basic structure doctrine. What is that all about?
This is basically the idea that there's some parts of the Indian Constitution that are so fundamental, so important, that they can't be changed, even by Parliament.
Whoa, so even Parliament has limits.
You got it. It's like saying, hey, there's some things that are so core to who we are as a nation that we can't mess with them.
That's powerful.
Yeah, it really is. It's a powerful check on power, making sure that the core values of democracy and the rule of law are protected.
That's amazing. And you know what? This whole idea makes me think of India's founding fathers, the people who wrote the Constitution. They were so smart to create a system that's both strong and flexible,
Right. Strong enough to protect its core values, but flexible enough to adapt to changing times.
It's a balancing act, isn't it? Okay, now let's look beyond India's borders for a bit. You gave us some info about their relationships with Bhutan and Africa, right?
Yep. It's a glimpse into how India is becoming a bigger player on the world stage.
Okay, so Bhutan first. You mentioned the Jellifi Mindfulness City project. What's that all about?
It's a really interesting project. Basically, India is helping Bhutan create a city that's all about well-being and sustainable development. It's like a model city focused on happiness and living in harmony with nature.
That's awesome. And India is helping them make it happen.
Exactly. They're providing financial and technical support, helping Bhutan realize its vision for this unique city.
So it's like a true partnership, working together to build something special.
Exactly. And it really shows how India is approaching its role in the world these days. Not just telling other countries what to do, but working with them as equals, respecting their values and aspirations.
It's like building relationships, not just throwing money around. And it's not just Bhutan, right? What about Africa?
India's relationship with Africa is growing really fast, too. They're working together on all sorts of things: trade, technology, education.
I can see how that would be a win-win for both sides.
Totally. India has a lot of expertise in areas like digital technology, renewable energy, and healthcare, and they're sharing that knowledge with African nations. It's a win-win, like you said.
And there's that phrase you mentioned before, right? Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is one family. It seems like they're really trying to live up to that ideal, not just talking about it.
It's definitely a guiding principle for them. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and that we need to work together to solve the big challenges facing the world.
It's a beautiful idea, and it's really inspiring to see them putting it into practice. So, where does this leave us? What's the big picture here?
Well, it's clear that India is becoming a major player in the world. And the way they interact with other countries, it's not just about power or money. It's about something deeper. It's about building relationships, promoting peace, and working together to make the world a better place.
I like that a lot. But we've covered so much already, and there's still more to explore. We'll be back soon with part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll delve into the role of civil society, the impact of technology, and the evolving landscape of pressure groups in India.
Welcome back. So we dove deep into education, the courts, elections, even the Constitution last time.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. We did. But there's still more to explore. Like, what about the people, right? Not just the government, but the everyday folks who make India tick.
Right, like civil society.
Exactly. You gave us some info on how those groups, the CSOs, NGOs, all those, how they fit into the whole governance picture in India.
Yeah, they play a really important role, especially when it comes to actually delivering services to people.
You mean like stuff the government is supposed to be doing, but maybe isn't always reaching everyone?
Yeah, exactly. Like in remote areas or for specific groups that might get overlooked.
Hmm.
CSOs and NGOs can step in and fill those gaps. They're often closer to the communities they serve, so they can be more responsive and flexible.
It's like they're the bridge between the big government machine and the people on the ground.
Right. And they can act as watchdogs, too, making sure the government is doing its job properly and not wasting resources.
Oh, yeah, keeping things honest.
Exactly.
Mm.
They're really important for promoting transparency and accountability, making sure things are done fairly.
But it's not all smooth sailing for these groups, right? You mentioned some challenges they face, too.
Yeah, for sure. Like sometimes there are concerns about corruption within these organizations, just like in any other sector.
Makes sense, yeah.
And sometimes they become too dependent on government funding, which can compromise their independence. They have to be careful not to become just an extension of the government.
Right, they need to maintain their own voice and agenda.
Exactly. And then there's this whole issue of foreign funding, which can be controversial. Some people see it as interference in India's internal affairs.
That's a whole other can of worms. So it sounds like there's this constant balancing act trying to harness the power of these groups while also making sure they're operating ethically and transparently.
Yeah, finding that balance is key. But overall, I think it's clear that CSOs and NGOs play a vital role in making India's governance work for everyone, especially the most vulnerable.
It's like a check and balance on the system, making sure no one gets left behind.
Right, exactly.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about pressure groups. I know it might sound a bit shady, but you said they're actually a normal part of any democracy, right?
Yeah, totally. They might have a bad reputation sometimes, but they're just groups of people who get together to try and influence the government.
So like lobbying.
Exactly. Like if you're really passionate about clean air, you might join an environmental group that lobbies the government for stricter pollution controls.
Makes sense, yeah. Strength in numbers.
Right. And you categorize them into different types, like associational, non-associational, institutional, and even anomic.
Whoa, lots of big words. Break that down for me.
Okay, so associational groups are like the classic ones, with a clear structure and membership. Think trade unions or business associations. They often have a lot of resources and influence.
Makes sense. What about the non-associational ones?
Those are more loosely organized. They might not have a formal membership list or even a headquarters, but they're united by a common interest or identity.
Like a movement, kinda.
Yeah, exactly. Think of groups advocating for women's rights or indigenous people's rights. They might not have a lot of money or political connections, but they can be really powerful when they mobilize people around a cause.
Right, people power. What was that, the third type again? Institutional.
Ah, those are groups that get their influence from being part of an existing institution, like the military or a religious organization.
Oh, okay, so they're already kind of embedded in the power structure.
Exactly. They might not be out there protesting in the streets, but they can wield a lot of influence behind the scenes.
Got it. And then you mentioned anomic groups. What are those all about?
Those are the wild cards. They pop up spontaneously in response to a specific event or issue.
Like a sudden outrage about something.
Exactly. Think of a protest movement that erupts after a major environmental disaster or a controversial government policy.
So they're driven by the moment, kind of unpredictable.
Yeah, they can be really powerful in the short term, but it's hard for them to sustain that momentum over time.
It's like a burst of energy, but it can fade quickly.
Exactly. And they often lack the organization and resources to really push for long-term change.
So lots of different types of pressure groups, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. But one thing's for sure, they can really shake things up.
Oh yeah, they definitely make things interesting. And they help ensure that different voices and perspectives are heard in the political process. It's all part of what makes India's democracy so vibrant and dynamic.
Love that. Okay, let's move on to something a little less, let's just say loud than pressure groups. You included some info about these things called quasi-judicial bodies.
Oh yeah, those are
So
interesting.
what are they, like mini courts?
In a way, yeah. They're like specialized bodies that can resolve disputes outside of the regular court system.
So like for specific issues.
Exactly, like taxation, environmental stuff, consumer complaints, things like that.
So instead of clogging up the regular courts with all those cases, they have these specialized bodies to handle them.
Exactly. They're often faster and more efficient than going through the whole court process, which can be a huge advantage for people, especially if you don't have a lot of money or legal expertise.
Makes sense. It's like a shortcut to justice, kind of.
In a way, yeah. And they can be less formal and intimidating than a regular courtroom, which can make it easier for people to get their issues resolved.
I can see how that would be appealing, but I guess there are downsides too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like, there are concerns about bias, making sure these bodies are actually impartial and not influenced by outside pressures.
Yeah, that's always a concern.
And transparency is important, too.
Hmm.
People need to be able to see how these decisions are being made to make sure everything's above board.
So accountability and transparency, those are key.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of, like, if you disagree with their decision, what can you do? The options for appealing their decisions might be more limited than with a regular court.
So there's less room for checks and balances.
Right. It's a trade-off.
Yeah.
You get efficiency and accessibility, but you might sacrifice some of the safeguards of the regular court system.
Right. So it's about finding that balance again, isn't it? Making sure these bodies are serving their purpose without compromising fairness or justice.
Exactly. It's a constant challenge, finding that sweet spot where things work well for everyone.
Okay, enough about courts and legal stuff. Let's talk tech. I mean, you can't talk about governance these days without talking about the digital revolution, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's transforming everything.
And you gave us some cool examples of how India is using tech to make their government work better.
Yeah, like the whole Digital India program. It's a huge initiative to bring government services online, making it easier for people to access things like applying for documents or paying taxes.
So, like, no more standing in line for hours at government offices.
Hopefully not. That's the goal anyway, to make things more efficient and convenient for everyone.
That sounds amazing, especially for a country as big and diverse as India. But it's not just about websites and online forms, right? You mentioned data analytics and AI, too.
Yeah, that's where things get really exciting. They're using data to understand what's working, what's not, and how to improve things. Like, by analyzing data on healthcare, they can figure out where to allocate resources more effectively.
It's like using data to make smarter decisions.
Exactly. And with AI, they can automate a lot of tasks, freeing up human resources for more complex issues. It has the potential to revolutionize how governments operate.
It's like bringing the power of Silicon Valley to the world of governance.
Exactly.
And you also mentioned this for HotNet project. What's that about?
That's all about connecting rural India with high-speed internet. It's a massive undertaking, but if they can pull it off, it'll have a huge impact on people's lives.
So it's about bridging the digital divide, making sure everyone has access to the same opportunities, regardless of where they live.
Exactly. It's about creating a more inclusive and equitable digital landscape.
That's a worthy goal, for sure. Okay, so we've seen how the national government is using tech to improve governance, but what about at the state level? You gave us some examples from Assam, right?
Yeah, Assam's been really proactive in adopting e-governance solutions.
So what are they doing?
Well, they've got a whole bunch of projects going on. Samarth is for online school admissions. Mission Basundara is digitizing land records. And they're even working on turning traditional village councils into digital Gan panchayats.
Wow, so they're really embracing the digital revolution at all levels.
Yeah, they're showing that e-governance isn't just for big cities or national projects. It can have a real impact at the grassroots level, too.
It's like bringing the 21st century to every corner of the state. Okay, enough about tech for now. Let's talk about something a bit more traditional. Judges,
Hmm.
specifically how they're appointed in India.
Ah, that's a tricky one.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of debate about that. Some people want more transparency, others are worried about maintaining judicial independence. It's a tough balancing act, right?
It really is. On the one hand, you want to make sure that judges are appointed fairly and impartially without any undue influence from the government.
Right, no cronyism or anything like that.
Exactly. But at the same time, you don't want to politicize the judiciary, making them feel like they have to please the government to keep their jobs. That would undermine their ability to make impartial rulings, you know.
It's a delicate balance for sure. And it seems like India has been trying to find the right formula, right? You mentioned something about the National Judicial Appointments Commission.
Yeah, that was an attempt to reform the system, but it ended up being struck down by the Supreme Court.
Wow, so even the attempt at reform became a legal battle.
It shows how sensitive this issue is. The courts are very protective of their independence, and they're not going to let any changes happen that they think might compromise that.
So it's an ongoing debate, one that's likely to continue as India's democracy evolves.
Definitely. It's one of those issues where there are no easy answers.
Okay, let's zoom back out to the international scene. We talked about Bhutan before, but you gave us some more details about that Jellifu Mindfulness City project, right? What else is there to know about it?
Well, I think what's really interesting about this project is that it's not just about building a city, it's about building a certain kind of city, one that prioritizes happiness, well-being, and sustainability.
So it's not just about concrete and steel, it's about a different way of life.
Exactly. It's about creating a city that's in harmony with nature, where people can live fulfilling and meaningful lives.
It's like a vision for the future, a model for how cities could be built in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's pretty inspiring, and it's a great example of how India is using its resources and expertise to help other countries achieve their development goals.
And not just imposing their own ideas, but working together as partners, right?
Exactly. It's a collaborative effort where both sides benefit from the exchange of knowledge and experience.
Okay, what about Africa? We touched on that before, but what's the latest on India's relationship with the continent?
Well, it's definitely a growing relationship, both economically and diplomatically.
So what are they working on together?
It's a pretty broad range of areas, from trade and investment to education and healthcare. India is investing heavily in infrastructure projects in Africa, and they're also sharing their expertise in areas like agriculture and technology.
It sounds like a mutually beneficial relationship. India gets access to new markets and resources, and African nations get access to investment and expertise.
Exactly. And there's this whole idea of South-South cooperation, where developing countries are working together to help each other rise up.
Kind of like a we're all in this together approach.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really powerful message, especially in today's world, where there's so much division and conflict.
And remember that phrase we talked about before, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is one family.
Yeah, that's a core principle in India's approach to foreign policy. It's about seeing beyond national borders and recognizing our shared humanity.
It's like bringing a bit of heart and soul to international relations.
Exactly. And it's something that I think the world needs more of these days.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, from civil society to pressure groups, from digital governance to judicial appointments, and even touched on India's role in the world. What a journey. But we're not done yet. There's one more piece of the puzzle to explore. In our final part, we'll step back and look at the big picture, trying to connect all these threads and understand what it all means for the future of India's governance. Okay, so we've gone deep on, like, everything. Education, the courts, those village councils, even how they pick judges. Man, it's a lot.
Yeah, we really did cover a lot.
It's like a crash course in how India works. So stepping back now, what does it all mean? Like, what are the big takeaways from all of this?
You know, what really stands out to me is this idea of balance. India is constantly trying to find that balance between tradition and modernity, between a strong central government and giving power to local communities. It's like they're always adjusting, trying to find that sweet spot where things work best.
Yeah, I see that like with the whole basic structure doctrine thing, right? They want a stable system, but they also want to be able to adapt and change with the times. It's about protecting those core values while still moving forward.
Exactly. And we saw that same idea with decentralization. It's great to empower local communities, but you also need to make sure they're accountable and effective. It's about finding that balance between local control and national unity.
Right. Got to make sure everyone's rowing in the same direction, but still letting them steer their own boats a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even in their foreign policy, you see that same theme. They're becoming more assertive on the world stage, but they're also focused on building partnerships and cooperation.
Like they're not just looking out for themselves, they're trying to make the whole world a better place, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of that, like with that whole Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam thing. The world is one family. They're really trying to put that into action.
I like that a lot. Okay, so for someone who's like just starting to learn about India, what's the big takeaway here? What do they need to know to really get it?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that India is complex. There's no single answer to any question, no easy solution to any problem. It's a country of contradictions, of ancient traditions and modern aspirations, of incredible diversity and a strong sense of unity.
Yeah, you can't put India in a box.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. To understand India, you have to embrace that complexity. You have to be open to multiple perspectives, to different ways of seeing the world.
It's like a giant puzzle, but every piece is different.
And the pieces are always changing, always moving. It's a dynamic country, always evolving, always finding new ways to balance its ancient heritage with its modern aspirations. So for you, as you continue to explore this amazing country, keep that in mind. India is a journey, not a destination.
Beautifully said. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining me on this journey. It's been an eye-opener for sure. And to all our listeners, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that sense of wonder alive. India is a country that will never cease to amaze you.